The wind howled like a wild beast, battering the cabin with such ferocity that it seemed the walls quivered under its assault. Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, covering the ground with an ever-thickening blanket, erasing footprints and drowning the road to the past. Lawrence Carlyle, or simply Larry, sat in an old rocking chair, wrapped in a coarse woolen blanket. He stared into the fire as if searching the dancing flames for answers to the questions that haunted him. But this was no ordinary winter night. Something about it felt off. The wind didn't just howl, it whispered, carrying with it an undertone that Larry couldn't quite decipher. Maybe it was the solitude, too long and too deep, or just sheer exhaustion, but the sense of unease grew with every passing second. And then it began. At first it was a faint scratching sound. Larry froze, listening. The wind, he thought. Sinking back into his chair, he tried to focus on his book, but the sound returned. Persistent, as if someone, or something, was demanding his attention. Larry glanced at the door, a chill creeping down his spine. Not from the cold, but from an unshakable premonition. Again, scratch, scratch. Larry rose slowly from his chair, his feet treading carefully on the wooden floor, which creaked treacherously in the silence. Grabbing a flashlight from the stand by the door, he hesitated, straining to make sense of the sounds outside. The scratching stopped, leaving only the wailing of the wind to break the quiet. "Who's there?" His voice was quiet but firm. No response. He opened the door. The icy wind struck his face like a slap, swirling snow into the cabin. The flashlight beam swept over the porch, and what it illuminated made his heart skip a beat. There, standing just beyond the threshold, was a dog, a large German shepherd. Her body trembled, covered in snow, and her ribs were visible beneath her emaciated coat. The dog's eyes, deep and desperate, locked onto his. They didn't plead, they screamed for help. "Oh my God," Larry whispered. He took a step forward, but the dog staggered and collapsed. He barely managed to catch her. Her fur was icy, her body frozen to the core. "You're going to live," Larry muttered, shutting the door with his foot. It felt as though he was speaking not just to the dog, but to himself, as if his own survival depended on saving her. He carefully laid her on the rug by the fire, his hands trembling as he grabbed an old blanket to wrap around her. She breathed shallowly, but her chest still rose and fell. There was hope. "Stay with me, buddy," Larry said, his voice soft but determined. He hurried to the kitchen, grabbed a bowl of warm water and a towel, and knelt beside her. He began rubbing her frozen paws gently, his movements careful, as though she might shatter under his touch. The dog stirred slightly, her ears twitching. Larry froze. "Can you hear me?" he whispered. The dog didn't answer, but her breathing grew steadier. A spark of life flickered in her eyes. The room grew warmer, but outside the snow continued to pile against the windows. The wind moaned like a lost soul, and Larry couldn't shake the feeling that something else was coming with the dog. "Who are you? Where did you come from?" he murmured, more to himself than to her. Questions swirled in his mind, but answers eluded him. As the fire crackled and the dog slowly thawed, Larry felt an odd calmness settle over him. He didn't know who this dog was or why she had chosen his doorstep, but he understood one thing. This encounter had changed everything. The fire burned brighter in the hearth, filling the cabin with warmth and a soft glow. Larry sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, watching the dog. Her coat was beginning to dry, glistening in the firelight. She looked calmer now, though her chest still rose and fell heavily, as if each breath was a struggle. Larry reached out cautiously to touch her head, but hesitated, unsure how she might react. Instead of growling or flinching, the dog tilted her head slightly and looked at him. That gaze, deep and piercing, stirred an emotion in him that he couldn't quite define. "It's going to be okay, girl," he said softly. "I promise." For a moment he closed his eyes, letting the exhaustion of the past few hours catch up with him. It felt as if the tension had finally begun to release its grip. But then, through the howl of the wind, he heard it again. Scratch, scratch. At first he thought it was just his imagination, but the sound came again, louder this time. Larry froze, his body rigid. He turned his head toward the door, his heart beginning to race. "Again?" he muttered, rising slowly. His muscles ached with fatigue, but adrenaline quickly kicked in. This time, the dog lying by the fire also heard the noise. Her ears twitched and she raised her head, letting out a low, guttural growl. It was a quiet but unmistakable warning that sent a chill down Larry's spine. "You hear it too, don't you?" he said, glancing at her before grabbing the flashlight and heading to the door. The cold air slammed into him again as he cracked the door open. This time, the wind seemed even more furious, swirling snow into the cabin like an invading force. Larry shone the flashlight onto the porch and froze. There, standing in the storm, was another dog. Smaller than the first, her thin body was covered in a blanket of snow, and her large, sorrowful brown eyes stared at him with a silent plea. The dog's legs trembled, and each step she took seemed like a battle against an invisible force. "Oh, damn," Larry exhaled, disbelief washing over him. He crouched, extending his hand. "It's okay, little one. You can come here." The dog let out a faint whine, as if responding to his voice, but her strength was nearly gone. She took one more step before collapsing onto her side, gasping for air. Without hesitation, Larry rushed to her, scooping her into his arms. She was even lighter than the first, skin and bones, her thin coat saturated with ice. "Hang on," he murmured, feeling her shivers echoing through his own body. Kicking the door shut behind him, he carried her to the hearth, laying her gently beside the first dog. The first dog, whom Larry had mentally named Vega, lifted her head. She watched the newcomer intently, sniffing her cautiously. Larry couldn't miss the flicker of recognition in her eyes. Vega snorted softly, then leaned forward and licked the second dog's muzzle. It wasn't just a greeting, it was acknowledgement. They knew each other. "Are you family?" Larry asked, more to himself than expecting an answer. The smaller dog, whom he decided to call Astra, let out a faint sound, almost like a sigh, as Vega gently licked her ears. It was a gesture of comfort, as if to say, "You're safe now?" Larry felt a tightness in his chest. This wasn't just instinct, this was a bond. He ran to the kitchen again, reheating some broth and returning with 2 bowls. Vega eagerly began to eat, but Astra only sniffed weakly and turned away. Larry knelt beside her, holding the bowl closer. "You need to eat, little one," he said gently, stroking her neck. With his encouragement, she began lapping at the broth, slowly and hesitantly, but with each sip, her breathing grew steadier. Relief swept over Larry as he saw the light returning to her eyes, but the feeling was short-lived. Deep in his mind, a nagging thought whispered, whatever had brought these dogs to him wasn't over yet. Outside, the storm raged on. The wind battered the windows, as if trying to force its way inside. Larry glanced at the door and then at the dogs. Astra had curled up next to Vega, resting her head on the older dog's side. The sight was both heartwarming and unsettling. They were seeking shelter, but from what, or from whom? His thoughts were interrupted by a new sound. This time, it was the crunch of snow outside the door. Larry froze. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath catching. Slowly he stood, listening intently. It can't be another dog, he thought, moving cautiously toward the door. Gripping a sturdy wooden club he kept for self-defense, he unlocked the latch and eased the door open. Darkness greeted him. Snow swirled violently in the air, obscuring everything. But Larry felt it. He wasn't alone. A cold dread ran down his spine. He peered into the shadows, straining to hear past the storm, but there was nothing except the relentless wind. Shutting the door, he turned back to the dogs. Vega was staring at him intently, while Astra pressed closer to her, trembling slightly. Something was out there in the snow, and Larry knew that this story was just beginning. Morning brought only a brief reprieve from the storm. The gray sky hung low over the forest, blocking out the sun, and the air was still, heavy with icy cold. Larry Carlyle woke on the floor near the hearth, his stiff back reminding him of the long hours spent keeping vigil. The dog he'd named Vega lay nearby, her body still weak but her breathing now steady. The smaller dog, Astra, was curled up beside her, as if seeking protection. Their connection was unmistakable, and it touched Larry deeply, though the questions swirling in his mind refused to leave him in peace. He rose carefully, trying not to disturb them, and moved to the window. The snow had buried everything overnight, even the faint trail that led to his cabin. Yet something caught his eye. Faint, partially covered tracks. They led from the forest to his doorstep. "What brought you here?" he muttered, glancing back at the sleeping dogs. Larry had an unshakable feeling that their appearance wasn't random. He pulled on his heavy coat and boots, grabbing his flashlight. The dogs lifted their heads, watching him with alert, cautious eyes. "I'll be back soon," he said, trying to sound confident. But even he didn't believe his own words. The tracks were faint, partially obscured by fresh snow, but clear enough to follow. Larry moved slowly, his steps careful to avoid slipping on the compacted ice beneath the surface. Every crunch of his boots seemed deafening in the forest's eerie silence. He followed the trail, which meandered as though whoever had left it was wandering without a clear direction, sometimes stopping before continuing again. The further he went, the stranger the pattern became. Paw prints overlapped with human footprints. This wasn't just a coincidence. The dogs had come with someone, or been pursued. Larry's heart pounded as he realized the dogs might have fled from danger. After about 20 minutes, he came upon a clearing. In the center stood a decrepit wooden shed. Its roof sagged under the weight of snow, and its walls were cracked, with traces of old paint peeling away. The sight of the structure sent a shiver through Larry, though he couldn't explain why. Something deep in his gut told him this was where he'd find answers. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, scanning the area. The trees around the shed loomed tall, their snow-laden branches bending as though guarding the place. The silence was suffocating. Approaching the shed, Larry noticed rusted cages stacked along one of the exterior walls. They were empty, but the rust and grime made it clear they'd once held something, or someone. Paw prints and disturbed snow around the area hinted that the cages had been used recently. The sense of dread tightened its grip. Inside, the shed reeked of damp and decay. Weak light filtered through the cracks in the walls, casting eerie shadows. Larry raised his flashlight, its beam revealing the interior. Empty bowls, torn scraps of fabric, and broken collars scattered across the floor. On the ground lay a chewed leash, its frayed edges suggesting a desperate escape. But what struck Larry most was the small leather notebook sitting on a table in the corner. It looked out of place, almost as if someone had left it there deliberately. He picked it up, the cracked leather rough under his fingers. Flipping through the pages, he skimmed the entries. Dates, descriptions of dogs, and strange numbers. His stomach churned as he turned the pages until one note stopped him cold. Object number 12, German Shepherd. Strong, resilient, suitable for fights. High resale potential. A wave of nausea hit him. The dogs he'd found weren't just strays. They'd been kept here, likely for dogfighting or some other cruel purpose. Larry slammed the notebook shut, his hands trembling with anger. This wasn't just an abandoned shed. It was a place of pain and suffering. Stepping back outside, the biting wind hit him again, but this time it carried a more sinister edge. The dogs hadn't stumbled upon his cabin by accident. They had escaped. Scanning the ground around the shed, Larry's eyes fell on a fresh set of tracks. These were larger, distinctly human. They led back toward the forest in the direction he'd come. "You didn't just leave them," Larry muttered, his fist clenching. "You're still out there." In that moment, Larry knew his responsibility had shifted. He wasn't just protecting these dogs. He had to confront the people who had caused their suffering. Heading back toward the cabin, he resolved to prepare for whatever came next. This wasn't just a random encounter. It was the beginning of a battle he hadn't planned on fighting. The cabin was tense with uneasy silence. Vega lay by the hearth, her watchful eyes following Larry as he paced the room, glancing out the window every few minutes. Astra slept curled against her side, though her sleep was restless. She twitched and whimpered softly, as if reliving some unseen nightmare. Larry couldn't sit still. The notebook burned in his hands, a damning piece of evidence of something dark and horrifying. He had tried calling the authorities, but the storm still interfered with the signal, and every call dropped before he could get through. The frustration only deepened his sense of urgency. "We can't just sit and wait," he muttered, glancing at the dogs. "If he's still out there, we need to be ready." Larry took down the old hunting rifle from the wall, checking it carefully before placing it near the door. On the table, he laid out a knife, a last resort, but one he might need. His instincts told him the danger wasn't over. A sound broke through his thoughts, the faint crunch of snow outside. Someone was there. Vega lifted her head, her ears pricking sharply toward the door. A low growl rumbled from her throat, deep and menacing, sending a shiver down Larry's spine. Astra stirred awake, pressing closer to Vega for reassurance, but watching the door with wide, frightened eyes. Larry grabbed the rifle, moving quietly to the window. He didn't dare turn on the lights, wanting to remain unseen. Peering through the frosted glass, he spotted movement. Figures were shifting between the trees. There were at least 3 of them. One stood out, a large, imposing man whose confident gait was unmistakable. It was him. Larry clenched his jaw. Judd had found them. "Here we go," Larry muttered under his breath, the rifle steady in his hands despite the pounding of his heart. Judd's voice broke the silence, cold and sharp against the wind. "Hey, Carlisle," he called out, his tone mocking. "I know you're in there. Let's talk. Don't make us do this the hard way." Larry tightened his grip on the rifle. "Get out of here," he shouted back. "This is private property." Judd laughed, his voice carrying easily over the howling wind. "Oh, come on now. We both know how this ends. Those dogs are mine. You could have just handed them over, but no, you had to be a hero." His tone darkened, laced with menace. "Now it's going to get messy." The silence that followed was worse than his words. Larry strained his ears, trying to track their movements. A faint creak alerted him. They were circling the cabin. Vega growled again, low and steady, her body tense and ready. The first attack came suddenly. Glass shattered as a makeshift torch, an old stick wrapped in rags, was hurled through a side window. Flames flared as the torch landed, its oily rag catching immediately. Larry lunged for it, grabbing the burning stick and throwing it back outside before the fire could spread. From outside, a string of curses echoed, followed by Judd's angry yell. "You're gonna pay for that, you son of a bitch!" Larry didn't wait for their next move. He fired a shot into the air through the broken window. The blast cracked like thunder, startling a flock of crows that erupted from the trees in a flurry of wings. For a moment, there was silence. Then Judd's voice came again, low and dripping with disdain. "You think a gun's gonna scare us off? You're outnumbered, Carlisle. Just give us the dogs and we'll walk away. No harm done." "Get lost!" Larry shouted, his voice unwavering. "You'll never touch them again." Vega was at the door now, her growling intensifying. Astra followed close behind, her small body trembling but her gaze fierce. Larry felt a surge of pride and determination. These dogs weren't just victims. They were fighters just like him. The attackers didn't stop. Another figure approached the rear of the cabin, trying to pry open a window. Vega was faster. With a fierce bark, she leaped at the window, her claws scraping against the frame. A startled cry from outside told Larry that her presence had made an impression. Seconds later, a loud thud signaled that whoever had been there had fallen back into the snow. "Good girl," Larry muttered, a grim smile tugging at his lips. The battle dragged on. Each assault met with resistance. Judd and his men tried to break down the barricaded door, but Larry fired another warning shot, forcing them to retreat momentarily. Vega's relentless growls and Astra's sharp barks filled the cabin with an atmosphere of defiance. Larry knew they couldn't hold out forever, but each minute they held the attackers at bay felt like a victory. Finally, Judd's voice rang out again, this time filled with frustration and barely contained rage. "This isn't over, Carlisle. You hear me? We'll be back, and next time, you won't get out of this alive." Larry watched through the broken window as the figures retreated into the shadows of the forest. He didn't lower his rifle until the last of them disappeared from sight. Only then did he lock the door again, his hands trembling from a combination of adrenaline and exhaustion. The cabin was eerily quiet now, broken only by the sound of Vega's heavy breathing and Astra's soft whines. Larry knelt down beside them, running a hand through Vega's fur. "You did good, girl," he said softly. "Both of you." Vega looked up at him, her golden brown eyes filled with something that Larry could only describe as understanding. Astra pressed against his side, her small frame shivering but slowly relaxing as the tension ebbed away. For a while, Larry simply sat there, his arms wrapped around the dogs. He knew this wasn't over. Judd would come back. Of that, he was certain. But now he also knew that they could face him, together. "We'll make it," he murmured. "We'll make it through this. Together." The next morning dawned cold and quiet, the storm finally retreating. Larry stepped out onto the porch, his boots crunching on the fresh snow. The air was crisp, and the forest seemed almost peaceful, as though it were trying to erase the violence of the night before. Vega and Astra followed him outside, sticking close to his side. Vega moved with purpose, her posture alert, her eyes scanning the tree line as though expecting danger to emerge at any moment. Astra stayed nearer to Larry, her tail wagging slightly but her body still trembling with lingering unease. The damage from the attack was clear. Broken glass, scattered footprints, and remnants of the torch littered the area around the cabin. But the sight didn't dishearten Larry. It only strengthened his resolve. "We'll fix this," he said quietly, glancing at the dogs. Vega's gaze met his, steady and unwavering, and Larry felt a flicker of reassurance. Later that day, after several failed attempts, Larry finally reached the authorities. His call was brief but detailed, recounting the events of the past few days and the evidence he had found in the shed. The dispatcher assured him that officers would be dispatched to investigate. When the police arrived, they combed through the shed, finding the cages, the chewed leash, and the damning notebook. The officers took Larry's statement and promised to follow up. "You've done a good thing, Mr. Carlisle," one of them said. "We'll make sure these people are brought to justice." Larry nodded, though a part of him remained skeptical. Justice might come eventually, but he couldn't rely solely on the system to protect him or the dogs. That evening, as he sat by the fire with Vega and Astra curled at his feet, Larry felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. These two dogs had come into his life unexpectedly, but they had brought with them a purpose he hadn't realized he was missing. They weren't just animals, they were family. From that moment on, the cabin didn't feel as lonely, and the forest, once a place of solitude and isolation, now felt like home.